Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about our long-term memory and how it's not really like a computer hard drive, unfortunately. I guess we all know that. So it's not like we store information and it's faithfully stored in our computer and we can just get it back out whenever we want to. We kind of already know this because when we've studied for a test, sometimes we can't get the information out that we need. So we're going to talk about how our long-term memory works and how sometimes it actually fails us as well. So our long-term memory stores information relatively permanently, but often some of those long-term memories can be pretty fleeting. So it's definitely not a computer hard drive. Now, it does appear to have limitless capacity, so we can remember a lot of stuff in our long-term memory, but we not only have to store information in our long-term memory, we also have to get it back out of our long-term memory, and sometimes we can have blocks in getting that information out of our long-term memory. So our memories are stored, especially, I think we talked about visual memories being stored in the back of the brain and the sound memories being stored in our temporal lobes, but the rest of our memories are stored as networks of neurons throughout our entire brain. So our memories are stored in networks, and each memory is kind of connected to another memory by meaning, by category. So if I ask you to think about your childhood pet, you're going to come up with an image of that pet. You're going to think about that pet's name. You're going to think about what that pet looked like, acted like, and then you might start thinking about your family. You might start thinking about your house at the time, different friends that you had. You might be thinking about pets that you might have now, pets you might want to have later. So you think about all these memories that are all connected together, and all sorts of information that you know about cats and dogs and whatever else. All that information is kind of stored in concepts and categories in your brain. We talked about concepts before too. So our brain organizes all that information, and so one memory leads to another memory leads to another memory. And so the interesting thing is that that's kind of the way our brain actually stores that information too. It's in a network of neurons. We're going to talk about that when we talk about the brain anatomy, the parts of the brain that are involved in memory. But neurons are definitely involved in memory, and they're networks of neurons that create each memory that we have. So it's pretty amazing. But there are two different types of long-term memories that you want to remember about. One is called explicit memory. And if you know what it means to be sexually explicit, you know it's kind of obvious. These are memories that we know that we have, that we're conscious that we have. They're memories that we intentionally have, right? They're conscious memories. And then, so explicit, thinking of what the word explicit means and attaching it to sexually explicit will actually help you get that information into your long-term memory. You probably won't have to spend too much time studying that information, and it might last longer in your memory because you know that word. Implicit memory is unconscious memory, and we have heard that term implicit and implicit bias a lot of late, and one of the things they're talking about is people having an unconscious bias against people of color, women, men, etc., and that we don't feel like we're consciously racist, but we can have some unconscious biases and ideas that might be pretty inaccurate about somebody else, and we might apply that information unconsciously to people. And that's one of the things that we do research in psychology, how do unconscious ideas sort of get embedded in our minds, and how does it affect our behavior and our attitudes about people and things. So let's first talk about our explicit memory. So these are deliberate, intentional memories that we know that we have. So these are memories of things that we've experienced, stories of our life, things that we remember about our childhood and things that have happened to us. And those are episodic memories. And what I always say is episodes of our lives, sort of like a soap opera. That's another memory technique to understand. If you know what episodes are, you know what episodic means then, right? And then you don't have to study that so much. Semantic, we talked about semantic encoding early on, how we encode information in our memory based on concepts and categories and by meaning. So semantic memory is our memory of different categories and concepts and facts. So things like the seasons of the year or fruits and vegetables, just facts that we know and that we've studied and learned in our life and that we're trying to remember as well. So those explicit memory is our conscious memory. Implicit memory is an unconscious memory. And so we know we have procedural memories, memories about how to do things, how to drive a car, how to ride a bike, how to tie your shoes. We also have implicit or unconscious memory of where these keys are on the keyboard on our phone. So if we're texting somebody, maybe the first time, if you remember that, that you texted somebody, you had to really pay attention to where those keys were on the keyboard, and you had to consciously pay attention to those. But eventually, you got to where you unconsciously know where those keys are. So you could type and not even have to look at those letters anymore, and you unconsciously know where those are. So that's our procedural memory. And procedural memories are really strong. You're going to have that memory probably forever. And there are other unconscious memories that can happen too. So sometimes when we've had a particular experience as a child or even as an adult, it could be a good experience, a bad experience. This one thought came to mind, that's why I chuckled a little bit, but I remember falling off a treadmill when I was working out once, and I'm still afraid of falling off the treadmill ever again. So I've been paranoid about that. So I've sort of been primed to be afraid of falling off a treadmill because I had that experience and I don't want to have that experience again. And Freud certainly said we have we've sort of buried bad memories in our unconscious mind, and yet those memories can sort of come up at bad times or make you have an emotional response that you might not understand. Why am I having this particular response to this event? But it's because of what happened to you earlier that your mind is responding in that way. So that's another type of implicit memory. So it can be emotional conditioning. They said priming, and what they mean by that is that a prior experience affects your new experience. So that's implicit memory. So remember explicit memory and unconscious memories. So procedural memories are just our memory of how to do things, and procedural memories are stored in the cerebellum. I don't know if you remember from the chapter 3 on brain anatomy, we talked about how musicians have a larger cerebellum, and that's because being musically, when you play music, you have to have really good muscle coordination and muscle memory, right? And those are procedural memories. So the procedural memories are stored there in the cerebellum, and the more and more you use those memories, the stronger and stronger those connections are. So if you've been driving a car for a year, those connections aren't as strong as if you've been driving for 10 years. But they're still really strong memories that will last a long, long time. So what about when we have trouble retrieving memories? We know we studied the information. We know, maybe we're just something silly that we're trying to remember an actor's name or an actress's name from a movie, and we just can't remember it, but we know it. We definitely knew it at one time, and we just can't remember it. So why is it that our memory fails us sometimes? A lot of times it's because the right cues aren't there. The right retrieval cues aren't there. The question is asked in a different way than we studied it. And so we just can't get that information back. And that sometimes does happen. So we do have what we call retrieval failures. And then these are 3 different ways that we actually test people's retrieval abilities and memory ability. So first of all is recall. And you're probably very familiar with this in college and probably in high school too. But these are just essay questions on the test where you're asked to recall all the information yourself. So you get very little cue, get very little information about what your response is supposed to be. You really have to come up with most of the response yourself. Whereas recognition is something that we do, which is multiple choice questions or even matching questions. So you just have to recognize the right answer. So you don't have to remember all of the information. You just have to be able to recognize which is the right answer. And then relearning is another way that we can test memory. So maybe you took an anatomy class a couple semesters ago, and now you have to take a more advanced anatomy class. You don't really remember a lot of that information from that previous class because it's been too long. And yet when you go to relearn that information, it's going to come back much more quickly than if you were just learning it for the first time. So we know that learning did occur before, even though you might not think you remembered it, that information was there, and those new connections were much easier to make that next time when you're relearning that information. So then we can also have what we call retrieval failures. So you stored the information, but you can't get it out. And this one's actually an interesting thing, is an example of, excuse me, of how the question is asked, and whether or not there's enough information in that question to help you get that information out. So if the retrieval cues are missing when the person asks you a question, it sometimes can be really hard to come up with the answer. So if I asked you what happened on May 6th of 2012, most of you would have no idea. If I asked you what you were doing on 9/11, some of you weren't maybe born yet, so you might not remember. But if you were, you might remember what happened that day. But this particular date's not a really dramatic, memorable date, right? So unless it was your birthday or something really significant happened on that particular day, that's not enough information. That's not enough of a retrieval cue for you to get that information back out. But if I asked you about that horrible accident your friend Mary had last year, you'd be, oh yeah, I remember that. That was horrible. And you would remember the details of the accident and information. You might not remember the exact date. You might remember a certain time of year and, those kinds of things, but you wouldn't necessarily remember that exact date. So it's important that the way a question is asked, that affects your ability to retrieve that information. And so sometimes that's probably why we get stuck when we're trying to remember actors or what do you call it, artists, things like that. I'm trying to put this down, but it won't let me. So this is, we remember that. We know it, but we can't get that information out. So it's like tip of the tongue. So you kind of, the person's name. You might have some of that acoustic memory where you can remember what it sounds like, but you just can't, or what letter it might start with, but you just can't come up with it. I was trying to remember the movie When Harry Met Sally the other day, and I could remember, Billy Crystal and Meg Ryan and the actors and the story, but I could not remember the name of the movie. And then, of course, a couple hours later, I remembered it. And that's what happens. Sometimes we just get a block for whatever reason. And sometimes the more and more we try to figure it out and try to remember it, the more frustrated we get, the less likely we are to remember it. Some of the things you can do to try to remember something is remember things that are related to it. Sometimes, then that's what we call this priming. So when you can't retrieve a memory, maybe if you think about things that are related to it, it might help trigger your memory later on. A lot of times when you're taking a test, if you're asked a question and you don't know the answer and you skip it, you go to the next one, a couple questions down, it starts to trigger your memory and you go, oh yeah, I know what that answer is, and you can go back and do it. Sometimes really focusing hard on trying to remember something can actually cause you to have more trouble. So I think that's it on long-term memory and some of the long-term memory problems that we have. So I'll look forward to talking to you in the next lecture.